Hi guys, David Ornstein here. The following clip is a section taken from my podcast, the Ornstein Chapman podcast. You can listen to the rest of the weekly show for free wherever you get your podcasts, and of course ad-free when you subscribe to The Athletic. I hope you enjoy it.
We are starting this podcast with Arsenal, and with a very good reason, of course, because head of football Raul Sanllehi has left the club. David will explain why he left and what that means for Arsenal, Mikel Arteta and the players. There's loads to get stuck into. We're also joined by James McNicholas, who writes about Arsenal for The Athletic and also co-hosts the Arsenal podcast Handbrake Off. Just before I bring James in, David, just start with you. Has this been coming for a while?
Well, there have been lots of suggestions inside and outside of Arsenal that this could be coming, and there's all manner of reasons why that could be, and James will go into them, I'm sure, in much more detail. It felt like it had come to the point where this decision wasn't a great surprise. It was more the timing of it that was a shock. Now, Arsenal and Sanllehi have put it down to the effects of COVID. We saw that Arsenal made 55 members of staff redundant, and on top of that, they really decimated their scouting department, which they say is a bid to modernise. People will have their own take on that. But to see a week or so later Sanllehi go, it makes me think there is more to it. We don't know. Arsenal have assured us there's nothing to it. But he was in the middle of the negotiations over the Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang new contract, over the potential signing of Gabriel from Lille and Thomas Partey from Atletico Madrid. He's not just anybody at the club, he's the head of football. And so removing that person at that moment in time is really curious. And I'm sure we'll continue to look into it and ask questions about it. Certainly, both parties are presenting a pretty united front, that it's all very amicable. But we'll see. It leaves Arsenal with a very interesting sort of situation, because they went down this route of a continental model under Ivan Gazidis, with various heads of department and a head coach just being dropped into the mix, part of the decision-making process, a real departure from the Arsene Wenger all-powerful manager scenario. And now they've kind of gone back in that direction with a number of departures pre and during and post sort of the COVID crisis, with Arteta rising to the fore alongside Edu as technical director, Vinay Venkatesham on the commercial side, basically heading up the club away from football but coming into the football conversation when it comes to finances, Huss Fahmy on the contract side, and they'll hope that that will lead them forward. But I've spoken to a lot of people that say this is a big loss for Arsenal, and that losing the Sanllehi contacts book and his relationships will be a real blow. Others will say that it's a good thing. He hasn't performed so well. Arsenal have had a number of problems sort of on and off the pitch, and Sanllehi didn't meet the expectations. The debate will rumble on, not least on this podcast.
Well, yeah, and James, if I bring you into it here, and I know David's mentioned COVID, do you think within the club they thought, well, we've announced that 55 members of staff are going to have to go. We're going to have to get rid of somebody near the top to look like it's equal? Or do you think there are other reasons?
That's not something I've heard, I have to say. And Arsenal's statement about Sanllehi's departure didn't mention COVID. It was actually in Raul's personal statement that he cited COVID as a cause for his departure. He said that was the only cause, in fact. And like David, I scrutinised that timeline, and I'm not so sure. You know, you look 6 weeks ago, Arsenal appointed a guy called Tim Lewis, a lawyer extremely well trusted by the owners, Stan Kroenke and KSE, as a non-executive director to the board. And our understanding is that Lewis's remit really was to ensure that the company, the business, the club was running efficiently in that time, and to kind of analyse and overview every department. 6 weeks on from that, Raul Sanllehi is gone. And given that his name, along with Vinay Venkatesham, was on the announcement of the 55 redundancies just 10 or 11 days ago now, it does feel like, although this may have been in the water, it may have been coming for some time, that there might have been some kind of catalyst, because it does seem to have accelerated towards Raul's departure.
We have spoken on this podcast before, myself and David and others, about what a seemingly complicated executive structure Arsenal have had over the last, well, since Wenger's gone, basically. That there appear to have been too many cooks.
I think that's an interesting perspective. I think, as David mentioned, Ivan Gazidis attempted to put in place a plan which I think anybody could look at on paper and say was quite sensible, really. He was the chief executive, and with Arsene Wenger heading towards the exit in 2018, he hired two guys to kind of work under him. One being Raul Sanllehi, who was to be head of football relations, a guy with a great contacts book who was known in Barcelona as a guy who could make deals happen. You know, someone else would identify the targets, but he had the contacts, he had the wherewithal to get those deals over the line. On the other hand, he had Sven Mislintat, who was to be the talent spotter. And the idea that these two guys could work in conjunction under Ivan Gazidis, I think, was fundamentally quite a sensible prospect. Of course, what happened actually in reality was that Gazidis left just a few months later for AC Milan. It created a bit of an executive vacuum. Sanllehi stepped into that. Mislintat was pushed out. And arguably, ever since then, I think we've sort of seen Arsenal kind of evolving in that situation without having a coherent plan. I mean, even the current technical director, Edu, as far as I understand it, was not the first choice. I think they wanted Monchi, who's now at Sevilla, doing a terrific job there. So Arsenal have kind of had to make do and mend ever since Ivan Gazidis walked out the door. And I suppose they'll be hoping that this point, with a maybe slightly more simplified, streamlined executive structure, could be a bit of a reset point for them.
It's interesting that Ivan Gazidis clearly felt that his job was done. He brought that sort of new team to the table, and that it was their job to take the club on, and he had a very attractive offer, challenging offer from AC Milan, whereas many would argue that his job was by no means done, and it was his duty really to help that new team blend together, to bond and to lead the club forward as a collective. Certainly egos clashed. There's been so much talk of influences. Some people in the process of compiling the piece that's live on The Athletic about why Sanllehi departed, said to me that he was perhaps a victim of placing too much trust in the hands of people around him. We know that he came from a commercial background at Nike and then at Barcelona too. And although he is vastly experienced in football, he's highly regarded in some of the biggest corridors of power, you know, in UEFA committees, the ECA, and depending on who you speak to, you know, he's regarded as one of the game's leading executives, movers and shakers. But equally, there's been a lot of focus and scrutiny on his relationships to a small number of agents, and they've been particularly involved in a lot of deals Arsenal have done. Now, there's no suggestion that there's any wrongdoing in those deals, but perhaps that they were not the right deals for Arsenal. They haven't panned out to be as successful as they should be if you're going to rely on these sort of people. So people have scrutinised Kia Joorabchian, people have scrutinised Arturo Canales. Many clubs have relationships, Wolves and George Mendes, for example, but it's about them being successful.
That's the difference, isn't it? But fans are comfortable with an agent, well, maybe not comfortable, but more accepting of a club having a relationship with a specific agent if the majority of the players that come turn out to be successful. If you get close to one or two agents, but the players that they bring don't exactly deliver on the pitch, then fans start to be suspicious.
We've got to point out that Arsenal have done a number of deals with other agents completely unrelated. Kieran Tierney, for example, Arsenal had a £20 million deal lined up for him. It was almost over the line. Unfortunately, in that period, with Arsenal stressing how cash-strapped they were and then going and signing Nicolas Pepe for £72 million, Peter Lawwell at Celtic put the asking price up to £25 million. So they lost out on money there. However, Raul Sanllehi managed to get that deal done because of his relationship with Peter Lawwell. They've been friends for many years, and people have said to me that that's what Arsenal will lose, those connections, and that had nothing to do with one of these agents we mentioned there. But on the flip side, there needs to be a success rate, and you know, George Mendes was brought in on the Nicolas Pepe deal that's been subject to vast scrutiny across the media. It's understood that Arsenal significantly overpaid for Nicolas Pepe, and there was a report published about an investigation into that deal the day before Raul Sanllehi was announced to be leaving Arsenal. And I think that situation's going to rumble on, not least because Arsenal's technical director, Edu, is very close to the aforementioned Kia Joorabchian, so people will be watching. There's no black and white to this because over time, some of those signings might pan out to be a success. We look at Cedric Suarez having barely played for Arsenal and getting a 4-year contract. The same with Pablo Mari. David Luiz getting an extension despite some mixed performances. But we may be sat here in a year's time lauding all three players. We take quite a small sample size and form judgments on it, and it's a pretty tricky business.
James, what kind of pressure does this put on Edu now? Because looking at it, this is all on him and Arteta.
I think there's substantial pressure on Edu now, actually, and he's been with the club for a little while now, but he's not been especially foregrounded, and I think the presence of Sanllehi kind of acted to shield him, really, to a certain extent. I think David's right to point out that Edu and Kia Joorabchian, by way of example of this kind of circle of agents that have been working around Arsenal, have a really big history together that goes back to Edu's time as a player and technical director at Corinthians. So I don't think that you can kind of pin Joorabchian's growing influence at Arsenal, as some say there is, on Sanllehi. I think you have to look at Edu too. I think that clearly he's now the most senior football figure in the club. And for a relatively young guy, that is quite extraordinary. And, you know, there's a huge responsibility on him in this window. I mean, David mentioned Arsenal were not planning, it seemed anyway, for Raul to be out the door at this point. He was across a number of negotiations with Aubameyang, but with transfer targets too, that Edu and Husfami, the contract specialist there, will now inherit. Arsenal expect that transition to be relatively smooth, but it is a test for Edu. And the scrutiny, I think, will be significant over the next kind of 6 to 12 months, where we find out to what extent, you know, was Raul Sanllehi responsible for the manner in which Arsenal was being run previously, and how is Edu potentially going to do things differently?
Just to check on the contracts thing, both of you on this. Obviously, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang and negotiations on his contract. Who takes responsibility for that and other similar internal contracts going forward, given Arsenal's rather checkered past when it comes to offering players new contracts or allowing them to leave on a free? I mean, they've had various misses over recent years.
That's a great point. So taking over now are Edu as technical director and Husfami as contracts negotiator. They've picked up the Aubameyang situation and they'll hope to deliver it. It's been moving in the right direction, but it's got to be right, and it's not done just yet. And also the negotiations over potential signings, future contracts, etc. They're the two main men on that side. But you raise a very good point on these misses, because one of Raul Sanllehi's proclaimments, I think it was a couple of years ago now, was that Arsenal would outsmart the market. And I'm not sure that's been considered successfully done. And also that they would not let players go into the final 2 years of their contract in a way that Aaron Ramsey did. He was the example kind of used as a sort of never again principle. Well, James may correct me, I think 14 players at Arsenal are currently in that position, chief among them Aubameyang. And so there is a lot of work to be done at Arsenal in a very pressurised and unusual summer and transfer market. And they'll be up against it because, meanwhile, rivals with greater financial resource will be investing and are already ahead of them. The likes of Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United will be striving to do so, Chelsea as well, Tottenham too. And so it's not going to be easy for Arsenal. This is a really difficult period, and it's going to have to be pretty expertly managed from the very top of the club, from the ownership, KSE. James mentions Tim Lewis has come on board as well. Josh Kroenke over the past couple of years as a director has been heavily influential, increasingly so, a more visible presence around the club. He was coming over a lot. COVID has restricted that, and I'm sure it's been frustrating that he hasn't been able to get over at all during such a critically important period with so much going on at the club. And so what happens in the coming months there is going to be just fascinating.
And the CEO in all of this?
Well,
I mean, you see, James, you know, we talk about too many cooks, just to add another level into it as well. What's his remit now?
Well, so Vinay Venkatesham was kind of in a joint CEO role, I guess you'd describe it as, with Raul Sanllehi. When Ivan Gazidis left, his role was effectively divided in two between the football and the sporting dimension of the club, as Raul used to call it, and the business side. Now, obviously, with Raul gone, Vinay kind of inherits the whole thing. I don't think he's been officially termed the chief executive yet, but for all intents and purposes, that is what he will be. And it will be interesting as well to see how he fares in that role. His background is in the commercial side almost entirely. Arsenal say that his involvement with the football side, with football matters, will be minimal, that he'll be sort of deciding budgets and things like that. I think what's going to be really interesting is to see, without wishing to complicate the picture any further for you, how the board are involved here. So we talked about the Tim Lewis appointment to the board. The Arsenal board contains Josh and Stan Kroenke, and also a couple of people who've been associated with Arsenal for a very long time, Lord Harris of Peckham and Ken Fryer. And until recently, that board had kind of been a little bit sidelined from the decision-making process. The power rested with the executives, really. I think that Tim Lewis arriving there, who is the guy who advised Stan on his initial purchase into Arsenal over a 4-year period, I believe, between 2007 and 2011, up until he took a majority stake in the company. His presence there has, as far as I can see, restored a little bit of authority to that traditional board.
He's an Arsenal fan, isn't he?
He's a lifelong Arsenal fan.
From the article that's on The Athletic.
He's a lifelong Arsenal fan, as are a couple of the other figures there. And I think that some of their grievances, some of their concerns about the way in which the club was being run, maybe weren't reaching the ownership. But he operates, Tim Lewis, as a bridge between that traditional board and between Kroenke Sports Entertainment, the company that owns Arsenal. And I think that will be interesting to see if they build from there. Will they add a bit more football expertise at that level? It wouldn't surprise me, to be honest, if they look to diversify that board. We've already seen them strengthen it with Tim Lewis. I think there could be more additions to that to come. So the picture, although it appears simplified, there could be a couple of new figures sometime soon.
James, there was a small bit of info in the piece we've written about a move that a board member tried to make to speak to Arteta being blocked, and that the signing of Willian and the finalising of the contract taking place at the home of Kia Joorabchian didn't go down well. Can you explain a bit more on that?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of issues that the board were unhappy with. There's the one that you mentioned where a board member wanted to speak to Arteta one-to-one. Raul Sanllehi didn't feel comfortable with that. He felt that the sporting side of the business was his domain, and as kind of the executive manager of that area, he should be present at that meeting. Now, that did not sit well with the board and was duly passed on to the ownership and may have contributed to the decision they ultimately made. There was another instance as well where the board wished to appoint David O'Leary, who of course is, I think, Arsenal's record appearance holder, or certainly was at some point, incredibly closely associated with the club. They wanted to add him to the board to offer a degree of football oversight. That was again rejected, that proposal, by the executive committee led by Raul Sanllehi. So that created a little bit of division, I think, between those two entities. On the Willian point, we understand that Willian's official contract signing took place not at Highbury House, not in the Emirates Stadium, not at London Colney Training Ground, but at the home of Kia Joorabchian. Now, there are potential explanations for this. We understand it may have been the appropriate place from a COVID point of view, that they wanted to find a kind of neutral venue where this could take place. But nonetheless, I think the optics of that would not have sat well with the Arsenal ownership. Stan Kroenke is a guy who, when he bought Arsenal, he bought a club that came with certain values associated with it. There was a brand with Arsenal that came with a certain degree of this idea of class and doing things the right way. And I think some of the discussion that has played out around Arsenal, around the influence of third parties and intermediaries in recent months, would not have been to his taste, and he would not have enjoyed that one bit. And that could also be another contributing factor to Arsenal arriving at this decision to part ways with their head of football.